Thank you. So welcome everybody to the Bitter Medicine panel. I am Maria Beanie with the IEEE Standards Organization. For those of you who are not familiar with the IEEE, we are the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. And in standards, you might know us from the suite of 802.11 Wi-Fi standard, which makes all our cell phones interoperate. So my work at the Standards Organization, I lead the life science practice, and we're exploring the use of blockchain, looking at from bench to bedside. We look at it also in the agriculture supply chain and other areas of life sciences. So I'm really excited by this panel here at Consensus. I've been coming to Consensus for 3 years now, and glad to see this get integrated more into the agenda. I think you're going to see more in the future. It's an exciting area where we're all exploring the use of blockchain and DLTs. So with me, I have a really great panel who have been, maybe you could call it bitter medicine, how much work you guys have been doing trying to figure out how to make blockchain work in a complex pharmaceutical supply chain. I feel like we need 3 days of just an event for this session, but we'll take it in 30 minutes. So first, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Somerville, who is CEO at Chronicled. Chronicled is one of the leading companies developing and deploying enterprise solutions by blockchain. She's also a co-founder of the MediLedger project and has brought together pharma and life science companies to design shared protocol to solve enterprise problems. And obviously, as well, Suzanne has had a nice established run as well in pharmaceutical organizations as well, so she has two sides of the coin to share with us today. With us, we have Scott Mooney, who is Vice President of Distribution Operations for McKesson Corporation. McKesson is a Fortune 6 company operating the US, Canada, European Union. For those of you who are in the world of pharma, McKesson is one of the 3 largest wholesalers, not only in the United States and globally, so very well established. And anybody who's in pharma supply chain world knows Scott. Scott is like our resident supply chain person.
Designated old guy.
And finally, we have with us Stefano Beanie, who is a global serialization lead at UCB, and he's responsible for the implementation of traceability of medicines worldwide. He's also part of the UCB IMI. IMI is the Innovative Medicines Initiative blockchain-enabled healthcare team, which is a big initiative in Europe right now. UCB, he comes from Brussels, and for those of you, UCB is a global biopharmaceutical company focused on the discovery and development of innovative medicines. So, as you can see, we have a little bit of diversity in our panel, giving you a 3-point view of what they're currently working on. We're going to cover a little bit of US FDA, a little bit what's going on in the EU FMD, how blockchain, we think, may or may not secure the pharmaceutical supply chain. So let's get to the first and most important question. So when we say blockchain for pharma supply chain, what exactly is the use case? Like, where is it the right fit? Where it may be needed and not needed? So I'll start with you, Suzanne, first.
Thank you, Maria. I would say with the work Chronicled's been doing in blockchain for, frankly, the last 4 years, more focused on pharma in the last 2, we've kind of boiled down the critical elements we believe are the elements that you would look for in a use case. First, and this has been described in other sessions today, the need for immutability. Secondly, the need for shared master data in the industry. One of the benefits in pharma is this is an industry that's worked for a really long time. I want to give Scott actually a lot of credit to really drive standards. So it's sort of a gift for blockchain that the standardization of how drugs are recognized is already somewhat established. I'll say somewhat. And so the idea that a company could put their master data that's already public on a blockchain for other companies to consume because they know it's coming from the source of truth is a really attractive concept. And then finally, this idea of using blockchain to enforce cross-industry business rules. And I think we'll talk about it with the use cases today, thinking about things like track and trace of prescription medicine, eliminating counterfeit. If you imagine, those are rules that actually need to be enforced across multiple companies. And in my mind, that becomes the attractive value proposition.
Scott?
Yeah, and it's an interesting topic when you start describing it simply from a pharma perspective. Because in pharma, you have things running from financial components and payment terms all the way down to tracking physical products to eventually medical records and things like that. So it's a very broad, diverse space, and it's tough when you just suddenly say, where does blockchain fit in pharma? You almost have to boil into sub-use cases, and we've looked at several so far. We've looked at verification of saleable returns. We've looked at track and trace data. We've looked at chargebacks and contracts. We've looked at a variety of different things in that way. Some of them have a lot of meat on the bone and I think are very viable. A few of them have kind of been a little bit more along the lines of, that's nice, but it's not telling me anything I didn't already know with my current tools. And and we've kind of had to step back from some of those assumptions at times. But it has been an interesting couple of year journey so far.
Stefano?
Yeah, definitely. There are many use cases in quite diverse, and I'm thinking first, yes, supply chain, and for example, temperature control. It's one for cold chain products. It's one of the field of interest. We are also thinking about established smart contracts with both with vendors, but also in case of clinical studies, because clinical studies is really managing data in clinical studies. It's quite a time-consuming and matter. So that's a possible field for expanding. Another one which is coming in those days is making the release process easier, and which in Europe it's still a bit of an issue, because when Europe is quite a small, it's a continent, but it's a community, but there are 28 member states, and each one of them has its own specificities. So sometimes you manufacture and you produce in one country, you release there. When you move the goods to the country of destination, you have to perform the release again, partially or in full. If you had a tool in order to share data safely, would be.
I think we have a similar problem in the United States when it comes to states having their own process and privacy of data, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So one of the things when we talk about serialization, a lot of this was born, and the idea of blockchain came out of when we talked about the FDA's Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or the DSCSA. And simultaneously, the EU had the FMD, which is the False Medicines Directive. So I thought it would be important, because there was a lot of conversation how blockchain might be the perfect fit to address that problem. So because Scott is our resident regulatory expert, whenever we want him to break down something to make it sense for the rest of us.
Again, designated old guy.
This is where we go to Scott. So Scott, maybe you can shed some light on, the difference between the two and understanding them, and perhaps when we say, what is like the barrier when we talk about blockchain and sort of these sort of being compliant and in a business transaction kind of thing.
So both the regulation in the EU and the US came about in about the same period of time. The genesis was 2012, 2013. In terms of how you identify a product, how you mark a product, very, very similar between what's happening in the EU and what's happening in the US. Both are specifying typically a 2D data matrix barcode on the product, encoded information on there that identifies the product by a trade item, a global G10 trade item. The lot number gets encoded in that, the expiration date gets encoded in that, and a serial number gets encoded in that 2D barcode. Now, for some of us, we may think that that's kind of an obvious thing, that product is identified that way, but until very recently, pharmaceuticals in the world were not identified in a machine-readable format. You would have human-readable text enclosed on a package somewhere that somebody could eyeball, and if you were in an English-speaking country, you read it one way. You would have Portuguese in another country. You might have French in another country. The barcode is somewhat universal to identify the product, and it was done in Europe and the US in a very similar fashion. But then comes the data. And the data is, what do you do with the information that is not only encapsulated in the barcode on the product, but is also in all of the systems that support the ability to create that product. In the EU, the requirement essentially is that the manufacturer who's bringing a product to market posts that data of all the serial numbers that they've created to an EU national or an EU hub. It's up at the top. It's the common EU hub. And then there are country-specific hubs underneath that where that data gets cascaded down to the appropriate country for where the product is going. At that point in time, the data is sitting there in this repository, the national repository, and ultimately when somebody goes to use that drug, they'll scan it, it'll ping back to that national repository and confirm, I'm looking at bottle 1, 2, 3, 4 of this particular item. Is this a legitimate bottle? So it's a verification process that's being done at the time, typically of administration. Sometimes it happens in a few other places, but typically it's at dispensing or administration to a patient. It doesn't care where the product went to get to the patient. And that's the biggest difference between the EU model and the US model, is in the US we don't have that framework in the law for this central system that you have to verify against at the point of use. In the US, we have a track and trace model, which says if you're a manufacturer, you create the product, you affix that barcode to that product. When the manufacturer sells that product to me as a distributor, they essentially have to give me a title almost, if you will, or a pedigree document, although I try to avoid using the word pedigree. It has connotations to Florida and some old laws, so it's a traceability document, but they essentially title that to me. I now have data that says I own that product. I now physically have that product. When I go to sell that product to a dispenser, I create a title and pass it to the dispenser. It is a point-to-point in the law, at least. Everybody creates a new transaction and passes it to the subsequent purchaser and says, this is now yours. So very different in what you do. And unfortunately, that means the systems work very different as well.
Can I add one thing to that, Maria? Just for people in the room who are sort of shuddering in your seats at the idea that Europe created a central database. I think the thing to note is, Scott, you mentioned this is laws that started, that they were set into motion with like long lead times to actually implement. And so that date of set in motion was 2012, 2013, right?
That's when it started, and I think the go live was this February.
Right, and so I think the idea of blockchain was frankly nowhere in the discussion.
Yes.
One interesting note, I think for myself and my exploration and how blockchain came to the work we're doing, is that the US law actually defines in the law, in writing, that there will be an electronic interoperable system by 2023 to manage the track and trace of suspect product. When they wrote the law, they had no idea how it was going to be done. They're looking to industry to figure it out, but that's what differentiates the US from Europe that chose the central database model.
Now we'll add too, one other little complication is the US DSCSA law, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. It's very broad. It incorporates a lot of different topics. It was kind of like the one shot that Congress had in 2013 to clean up a bunch of stuff. So a portion of it deals with licensing. We talked a little bit about this track and trace piece where you pass this document through the supply chain in a digital format all the way through. But there is a verification module in there as well. It talks about it in terms of saleable returns. When a customer, a pharmacy, makes a return to a wholesale distributor, if that bottle has a serial number on it, the wholesale distributor is expected to scan that and verify that that was a legitimately assigned set of information, that the GTIN, the lot, the expiry, and the serial number correspond to the information the manufacturer assigned to a product. Now there is one of those cases when we started looking at it that the blockchain really had a lot of meat on the bone because we're looking at ways to be able to coordinate different data sets in different places, and it seems quite valuable in that regard. So DSCSA isn't just a singular term. You have to almost break that into use cases as well as to which ones really have some good value and which ones are a little more challenging.
Stefano, do you want to add anything from the FMD?
That's what's happening in Europe now for any dispensable item, which is causing not a few issues.
It was a rough February, wasn't it?
but yeah, it's a change of paradigm actually. So it's big impact in supply chain.
Excellent. So I'm sure most of you have read recently the FDA has been announcing more pilots in blockchain and that kind of thing. And obviously in Europe we have the IMI having these blockchain working groups where they're partially funded by the government and partially funded by the actual pharmaceutical companies themselves. So I would like to really, I think people would like to understand, where do we think the most valuable benefit is going to derive from these sort of pilots, these working groups that is really going to maybe potentially drive the adoption of these technologies? Maybe Suzanne, you want to go first?
So our Chronicled is working on solutions. I think, as Scott mentioned, product verification is one of the solutions that's actually going to go live as a commercial solution in the next couple months. But frankly, if I could step out of my own bias, I think this is still an evolving technology, and having a variety of organizations. Maria mentioned IMI. For those not familiar, it's a public-private partnership in Europe that is bringing pharma companies together that are going to explore blockchain use cases. Maria mentioned these FDA pilots. They've asked for people to present designs for how 2023 could work. And there's a variety of companies, both, I would say, with traditional technology as well as blockchain solutions. And I think, frankly, the more shots on goal, we're actually going to learn and iterate effectively as an industry of how this can be eventually solved, because it is kind of big and complex, like Scott said. There are a lot of parties who have different interests, and figuring out how and creative ways this technology can be used. I think that plate of different options is going to be really valuable to then hone in on exciting ways to use the technology. And I can almost say it's a gift to blockchain enterprise across industries, even beyond healthcare, because we're going to learn a lot of really interesting stuff of how this can be done.
Yeah, this will be an interesting path. I mentioned I've been doing this about 2 years, the blockchain portion of the exploration for McKesson. And a couple of things popped up fairly quickly, one of which I got quoted in somebody's journal here in the room. We talk a lot about trusted partners, but this is a lot about trading relationship situation in many cases too. Mm-hmm. While we all trust each other as an industry, there are puts and takes that sometimes come into play. So there's a little bit of reservation about candidly sharing all the traceability information and full visibility, because inventory investment is one of the biggest things that drives how somebody does in this space. Right. As a wholesale distributor, we are not merely about facilitating connecting 30,000 pharmacies with 600 manufacturers from a physical goods space, but for over 30 years we've been connecting them from a digital space as well. So sometimes when we get into some of the conversation, it's a sacrifice of, is it nice to start a blockchain initiative that's going to address this, but what does it do with our competitive market product that we've had right now from a digital service over here? Does it negate that? Does it minimize that? Or can we somehow kind of bring the two together? So there's been a lot of discussion in our groups, in our work groups about, well, I'm okay with somebody downstream seeing this activity, but that can't go upstream or things like that. And we've spent a lot of time talking about privacy. The closer we get to the patient, patient privacy kicks in. But even upstream of the patient, you have supply chain issues that kick in, where it'd be really nice to say everybody can see par levels on inventory wherever they may happen to be. But inventory availability is one of the things that a distributor A may use to be more competitive than distributor B. So there's reasons not to share necessarily everything.
Can I add one more thing? Yep. I actually want to recognize Scott. I've gotten the chance to work with Scott in the Metal Ledger project work we're doing, and frankly, all the other companies. I will say for myself, what's really exciting about what could come out of all this as well is the fact that companies want to come to the table and figure out where their collaboration can provide benefit for everyone. Scott's right. I mean, everyone in the back pocket is looking at their own business and the impact and what could be disrupted. But at the same time, this idea that this technology can enable distributed business processes between parties in a trusted way that you can all know everyone has to follow the rules that have been put into the code. It's really exciting for me to see companies actually so enthusiastic about collaborating and figuring that out. Mm.
So Stefano, maybe you can tell us from coming from the European side how you're working in IMI and seeing this move forward.
But I believe we are on the same ship. So we have to learn, definitely. We are in the learning phase still. There are a lot of great ideas, great proposals, but when we go and to see what is being done, there is still very, very little. So the pharma industry is very, very interested in the blockchain technology, but it's also very cautious. So what we are doing actually is we want to do something to prove how the technology can be good and fit our needs. But it's important to start small, a small scale with easy projects and pilots. And this is what we are doing at this stage in order to understand and learn.
Excellent. So working with technologists and engineers, right, we always hear, wow, what a great features of this technology. You know, it's completely transparent. So we always have the conversation, public versus enterprise public blockchains kind of thing. And I've had people tell me, they should put a whole clinical trial on a public blockchain or put the entire pharmaceutical supply chain on a blockchain. Scott, what do you say to something like that?
I would say a blockchain would be feasible for many parts of it. Public, purely public, that I really don't know. Mm-hmm. At least in the US side, one of the really odd things that we have is I at least tend to think about blockchain applications where you have millions of users accessing systems. The US pharmaceutical supply chain is relatively constrained. It's 600 to 700 manufacturers, depending upon how you count manufacturers. It's at the most 120 distributors. And then it's 60,000 doctors, pharmacists, pharmacies, hospitals, clinics. 60,000 is a big number, but it's not a gigantic number. The other part of it is the way those 60,000 are presently connected, they're tied to a trading partner. So realistically, I think you're talking about 1,000 entities that would be engaging in that blockchain. that could work very well in a private model. I don't see the need for a public model necessarily there.
What do you think, Suzanne?
I think in today's world, I don't think technology for a public blockchain makes sense. I think, at least based on our thinking, the players should be known. You know who you're doing business with. Back to, I think Scott alluded, there are parts of the law that actually describes what an authorized trading partner is. So knowing that you're doing business with an authorized trading partner, you need to know that. And I think we started talking about it. The privacy is going to be paramount. At least the solutions we've designed represent industry today, that you can see transactions one up from you and one down, and you don't get to see anything else. So there is no full transparency. If companies choose to sell each other the data afterward, that's their business, where they're allowed, and, but it can still enforce the business rules so that by the time it gets to the pharmacy, they can have the verification that it followed all the rules all the way from the originating manufacturer. So, and then I think lastly, Scott and I were just chatting, in the US, if we're looking at, let's say, a transaction posted to the ledger of change of ownership of prescription medicine, that's in the neighborhood 25, 30 billion a year in the US. If that needs to be verified against business rules, I would say the technology and speed, again, it could evolve, but today, public blockchains don't have that.
Yeah. From our company's perspective, we're looking very hard at how do we make the most efficient access to the data happen. So if the data exists on a blockchain, we still envision that we would have significant portions of it off block because we want to do some activity with that data upon receiving. We want to perhaps do some activity data for sure with that when we sell the item, and we would probably post both those transactional type events to a blockchain. But in the middle, we have things like deaggregating packages, we have put away functions, we have loading robotic picking machine functions. All of those things are opportunities where we're going to want to check that data sometimes, and to take maybe 4 or 5 touches per day on an item at the volume that we are and have them go external to hit the blockchain, probably not going to be practical. Our corporate size right now has us doing 42% of all the transactions in the United States on our platform. If we 5 times a day took every one of those transactions and went external, how fast would that response time be? That's one of our concerns. It's the one part about this that has really made me nervous, how fast it will be. When we first started talking 2 years ago, you were quoting me numbers in a couple of hundred transactions a second, and I think I was coming back going, no, that's not going to get it.
But Scott, wouldn't you agree that in the last 2 years, I'll say our initial work, everyone was like, oh, Hyperledger and Ethereum, and now I think actually the industry's looking for solutions, and you care a lot less about the technology, just that it works.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
What about you, Stefano?
I believe we need to start, again, a public blockchain. I don't know. At this stage, it's early to say data. Every party is really keen to manage and own its own data because the money is in the data, right? And so we see now the big discussion we are having about the usage of serialization data. We could do a lot with those data, right? Everything is already there. We had to do that. It's compliance. But what can we do today more than compliance with those data? And there are a lot of ideas as well, but it's just not happening because parties, there are no rules today, no clear rules and governance about also who owns the data, who can do what with the data. And so that's why I believe we need to grow and learn still.
That's actually probably a great tangent to the biggest problem we've encountered in all the work group discussions so far has been approaching topics along the lines of governance and then funding. And funding to a lesser degree because we haven't got past governance enough to really get there. But trying to have discussions about establishing the rules of who can see what, when, and some of that kind of stuff has been a fair amount of the time that we've spent so far. I mean, there's the regulatory piece, and then there's the other things that you could do with it piece. The regulatory piece is pretty straightforward. The law kind of dictates that. The other pieces are the ones that take the most time, and that's when you get into the competitive discussions.
But if I could say the use cases, in my mind, I don't mean to oversimplify because I do understand the implication to business. And every company, it's exciting to see them beginning to understand the technology more and think about what this is going to mean. But in my mind, a lot of the blockchain capability, frankly, drives plumbing between companies, interoperability between companies, and you guys need to decide the business models of how you take advantage of it or not. I know we were in one working group and a company asked me, they're like, oh, when are you going to evaluate who gets an advantage by building this solution? And my answer was, no one gets an advantage, it's just plumbing. And if you're faster at figuring out how to take advantage of the plumbing and make good business out of it, then so be it. But on the face of it, there's nothing I see, I could be biased, that really provides an advantage to anyone out of the box.
No, it's not an advantage necessarily. It is who sees what information that today they may not traditionally see.
Right.
It's discussions about contracting and pricing and things like that, yeah. One other thing we should mention in healthcare, and this is also another one of the interesting dilemmas, we talked about the difference between the EU and the US a little bit. There's differences inside the healthcare sphere quite a bit as well. The pharmaceutical space in the United States, in the pure pharma space, and I'm thinking here major brand manufacturers, generics companies, distributors, has been on the EDI system for 20 years, and it's heavily been driven by that. So a lot of the discussion there is going from 50 miles an hour to 70 miles an hour kind of a discussion. There's also discussions going on, though, sometimes in the medical surgical space, which has not necessarily been on that same type of platform. So when we talk about some of the stuff there, they also deal with drugs in the med-surg space. They're looking more from a 0 to 70 kind of a jump. They actually are driven sometimes a little bit more just because they have more incentive. There's a little sometimes less incentive because we're displacing some of those EDI characteristics.
Yeah. So the whole thing about the pharmaceutical drug supply chain, right, gets to the core of what we like to call the last mile, the patient, right? The whole idea is of protecting the supply chain, protecting the patients, keeping them away from counterfeits, maybe deterring them from using the internet to buy alternate source of drugs that might not be the right thing for them. So, and this is something that's really important at the IEEE Standards Organization is, what is the real benefit for the patient in this? Where can blockchain really deliver more value for the patient? I mean, I'm a patient. Can I go in one day and say, hey, you know what, this drug was really manufactured at Pfizer, and maybe it was distributed by McKesson, and it really got to CVS? Just as an example. Will I ever have that ability as a patient? Can it go there?
Do you want that?
I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are patients, right? I have patients who say, I want to see a whole clinical trials on a blockchain. So sometimes you have that.
I think for me, I think that's what people think. And a lot of the conversations with blockchain about full transparency, I can know everything. I actually think all you really want is to know it followed either the path it should or that it was safe. And frankly, I think most people would be satisfied with that answer, albeit they may not know the mechanism that ensured that it was. I personally think the solutions we're working on, if we got bold, could absolutely, I'll be bold, eliminate counterfeit. I think it could eliminate diversion. It could absolutely improve this, the security and safety of drugs in the United States, where today it's not a big problem, but it could ensure that it never will be.
Add to that, I think the one thing that needs to change, this is an evolution. The Drug Supply Chain Security Act was a 10-year rollout. Every 2 years something happened along the way. It's scheduled to end in 2023 by law as far as the last evolutionary step. But it only takes and tracks the product and does things into the door of the pharmacy. It's not mandated to get to the patient. I think that's the next piece that's coming. Pharmacy will have to evolve in a couple of ways for that to happen, though. One of the first of which is typically when you get a pharmaceutical today, you do not get any packaging that the manufacturer created. So the patient is unaware of the lot number, the serial number, the expiry date, because it's not on the label the pharmacy puts on. So
in the United States.
In the United States. Yeah. So there may be some evolution that has to happen there. The other piece of it that I think that's really going to be interesting to watch is human behavior when this information becomes available. You look at, it went from the manufacturer, from Pfizer to McKesson to the pharmacy to you as a patient. That's very short supply chain. That's very critical to make sure that that product is safe. But people will buy product that went from the manufacturer to distributor 1 to distributor 2 to distributor 3 to a pharmacy to distributor 4 back to a pharmacy again, and they'll still take that product because the human decision that says, that's a lot of steps that doesn't need to be there, I should skip that, is ignored. So.
Stefano, any final comment?
Yeah, I tend to see blockchain technology more as a means today, definitely to improve some stages and some processes. And so the advantage for the patient definitely is to get the medicine before than it happens today, and with more quality. So we could really follow, for example, the cold chain goods are definitely a field of application which is interesting, and today there is no full visibility in the chain sometimes, so it's quite weak.
That'll be the next time we'll talk about cold chain logistics, but unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank you guys for a great conversation. Thank all of you, and hopefully we'll bring it forward.